Welcome to Divine Peace. Tonight we'll read through the story of Daniel, a boy taken far from home, and the long, quiet faithfulness that carried him through 70 years of exile, to help you slow down, settle your thoughts, and drift into peaceful sleep. There will be no ads while you listen. If this channel brings you rest, consider subscribing, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Imagine a city on a hill. It is late summer in the year 605 before the Common Era, and Jerusalem is going about its day the way cities do when they still believe themselves to be safe. The sun has already climbed above the Mount of Olives. The stones of the streets are warm underfoot. Somewhere in the lower city, a woman is drawing water from a cistern. Somewhere higher up near the palace, a servant is beating dust from a wool rug against a courtyard wall. The sound carries a long way in the dry air. It is a very old city, this Jerusalem, older than the memory of the people living in it. Its walls have been repaired and repaired again. Its gates have known kings and prophets and merchants and shepherds, and the slow, patient traffic of pilgrims who walk in every year for the appointed feasts. There are quarters where the houses lean into each other for shade. There are markets where the awnings are stitched from goat hair and dyed cloth. There are alleys that smell of bread ovens and olive oil, of onions and dust, and the faint, sharp smoke of small fires kept alive for cooking. And at the very heart of the city, above everything, rises the Temple of Solomon, built long ago of cedar and gold and hewn stone. You can see it from almost anywhere in the city. Its walls catch the morning light, its roof glints, its courts open outward in careful, deliberate stages, from the wide court where anyone may come, to the smaller court where only priests may go, to the innermost place, dark and silent, that no ordinary person will ever see. The smell that hangs around the temple is a very particular smell. It is the smell of cedar. It is the smell of olive oil burning in lamps. It is the smell of incense, frankincense and myrrh and stacte and onycha, ground and blended by careful hands. And it is the smell of sacrifice, of animals brought in from the surrounding hills, offered up morning and evening, the smoke of them rising in a thin, steady column that people in the lower city have watched their whole lives without ever really thinking about it. That column of smoke is the pulse of the nation, the rhythm underneath everything, the morning sacrifice at dawn, the evening sacrifice at dusk, and in between, the ordinary noise of a city that has arranged its days around the presence of its God. The city has a king in these last years of quiet. His name is Jehoiakim, and he sits in the palace not far from the temple, and the people of Jerusalem know his name the way people always know the name of a king, with a mixture of respect and complaint, and the sort of familiarity that comes from hearing a name spoken every day of one's life. He is not a great king. The prophets say so, plainly and often. There is a man named Jeremiah who walks the streets and the temple courts and speaks words the king does not want to hear. Words about a coming trouble, words about the sins of the nation, words about a great empire rising in the north, a shadow gathering over the horizon, a hammer that will fall. Most people, going about their business, do not want to hear these words either. It is easier to draw water and beat rugs and buy bread and haggle over the price of lentils. It is easier to walk up to the temple at the hour of prayer and smell the cedar and the incense and let the smoke rise and tell yourself that things are as they have always been, because things do feel as they have always been. The vineyards on the hillsides are heavy with grapes. The olive presses are being readied for the harvest that will come in a few weeks. The fig trees are dropping their late fruit. The wheat is in. The barley is in. The threshing floors have been swept. There is a quiet confidence in the air, the confidence of a people who have lived in this land for a very long time and expect to live in it for a very long time to come. And in the upper part of the city, in one of the fine houses that cluster near the palace, there is a boy. He is perhaps 13 years old, perhaps 14. The records do not say precisely, and neither will we. He is at that age where the body is beginning to lengthen, where the voice is beginning to change, where the world is beginning to widen out beyond the household. His name, in the language of his people, is Daniel. It is a name that means, God is my judge. His parents chose it carefully, the way parents in Judah chose names carefully, so that every time the child was called for supper, or scolded in the courtyard, or greeted in the street, the name itself would be a small, quiet sermon. God is my judge, not the king, not the crowd, not the neighbors. God. Daniel is of a noble family. His clothing is well woven. His sandals are good. He has grown up with servants moving through the house, with the smell of good food in the courtyard, with the awareness, unspoken but constant, that his family belongs to the class of people whose sons might one day serve in the palace. He has been given the education that goes with such a birth. He can read, he can write. He knows the scrolls of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, not perfectly, not yet, but well enough that the phrases of them come easily to his tongue. He knows the Psalms, he knows the histories of his people. He can recite the names of the tribes, he can name the judges and the kings who came before Jehoiakim, and he can tell the story of David the shepherd who became the king, whose throne still stands in Jerusalem. He speaks Hebrew, of course. That is the language of his home, the language of the marketplace, the language his mother sang to him in when he was small. But he has also been taught some Aramaic, which is the language of trade and diplomacy in the wider world, the language of merchants coming down from Damascus and up from Egypt, the language a boy of good family will need if he's ever to sit in a court or negotiate a treaty. And he has 3 friends, boys of similar age, boys from similar houses. Their names are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Hananiah, the Lord is gracious. Mishael, who is like God. Azariah, the Lord is my helper. 4 boys with 4 names, and every name a small sentence about the God of Israel. You can imagine them, running through the narrow streets on some errand, sitting together in the shade of a courtyard learning their letters from an older tutor, standing at the edge of the temple courts on a feast day, watching the priests move in their white linen, feeling the weight of belonging to something enormous and old. They are, in their own small way, the future of Judah. The kind of boys the nation is quietly counting on. The kind of boys who will grow up into the men who will keep the books and mind the granaries and advise the king and teach their own sons the Torah and stand one day in the same temple courts and watch the same smoke rise. That is the expectation. That is the shape of the life laid out before them, to grow up in the land, to marry within the tribes, to raise their children in the shadow of the temple, to be buried in the fullness of years in the tombs of their fathers. Nothing in the life of Daniel in the summer of 605 suggests any other shape. The sun climbs, the morning sacrifice is offered, the city hums, and far to the north, on a bend of the Euphrates, at a place called Carchemish, something has already happened that will unmake everything. Carchemish is a name most people in Jerusalem could not point to on a map, if maps as we know them existed. It is a fortress town on the great river, a place where roads and armies meet. For years, for lifetimes, the world beyond Judah has been arranged around 2 great powers. To the south, Egypt, ancient and immense, with its pharaohs and its river and its long memory. To the north and east, first Assyria, and now the rising kingdom of Babylon, sprawling out from the marshes and canals of Mesopotamia. Small kingdoms, Judah among them, have lived their lives in the space between these giants, sometimes bending toward one, sometimes toward the other, always aware that the giants exist. Pharaoh Necho of Egypt has been trying to hold the north. He has marched armies up through the Levant, past Jerusalem, past Damascus, up to the very banks of the Euphrates, and now, at Carchemish, he has met the army of Babylon. The army of Babylon is commanded by the crown prince. His name is Nebuchadnezzar. He is a young man in his own way, not a boy like Daniel, but not old either, a man in the strength of his years, a soldier with an eye for organization and a mind for empire. He has led his father's forces up from the south of Mesopotamia, along the Euphrates, to break the Egyptian hold on the north, and at Carchemish he does. The battle is decisive. Egypt is broken there. The armies of Pharaoh Necho are shattered and sent reeling back toward the Nile. The road south, the whole spine of the Fertile Crescent, all the way down through Syria and Lebanon and into the hill country of Judah, lies open. Babylon is from that day the master of the world Daniel has ever known. Word travels slowly in the ancient world, a merchant here, a messenger there. By the time the news reaches Jerusalem, the battle is already weeks in the past, but it reaches the palace, it reaches the priests, it reaches, eventually, the market, and the courtyards, and the fine houses on the upper streets, and then, not long after the news, the army itself. The army does not come all at once. First, there are the reports of advance parties along the northern roads. Then there are the reports of city after city sending out its elders with gifts, bowing their heads, opening their gates. Then the horizon itself begins to change. Dust in the distance, the dust of many feet, the dust of chariots and pack animals and the long, slow trains of an imperial army on the move. Standing on the walls of Jerusalem, you would have seen it before you heard it. A haze along the northern hills, a darker line beneath the haze. Then, over days, the darker line becoming distinguishable into figures, into shapes, into the specific glint of spear points and helmets in the afternoon sun. They came, and they camped, and they did not have to besiege the city in the way sieges are remembered. King Jehoiakim opened the gates. There was no other real choice. The army of Egypt, which had been the counterweight, was broken and gone. The army of Babylon was here, at the wall, with its commander and its officers and its scribes and its long imperial patience. And so Jerusalem, in 605, did not fall in fire. It bent, it knelt, its king walked out and became a vassal, which is to say, still king in name, still on his throne, still wearing the robes of David's house, but now paying tribute to a distant emperor, now answering, in the last account, not to God, but to Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar, standing at the gate, took what he had come to take. He took gold, he took silver, he took the tribute of a kingdom. But he took something else too, something more careful and more terrible. He took the vessels of the house of God, the great cups and basins and instruments of the temple, the vessels that had been made in the time of Solomon, the vessels that had been used in the daily rhythm of sacrifice, the vessels that had never left the temple's precincts, were carried out through the courts by unfamiliar hands, wrapped in cloth, loaded into carts, and sent north. He carried them to Babylon, and the record is careful to note that he placed them in the treasury of his God. Not melted down, not scattered, placed, deliberately, in the house of another God, as if to say, in a language every priest in Jerusalem would understand, "Your God has been overcome, and here are his holy things sitting on the shelf of mine." It was an act of theology as much as of theft. And then he took the boys. This is the part that must be understood carefully, because it is the beat on which the whole rest of the story turns. Nebuchadnezzar did not send soldiers into the streets to grab whichever children they could find. He did not empty the orphanages. He did not sweep up the poor. He gave an order to his chief officer, and that officer was instructed to bring in young men of a very particular kind. Young men of royal or noble family. Young men without physical blemish. Young men who were handsome. Young men who were quick to learn. Young men skilled in wisdom, knowledgeable in understanding, apt to grasp what was placed before them. Young men who could stand one day in the king's palace. Young men, in other words, exactly like Daniel, exactly like Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah. This was not the cruelty of a raid. It was the strategy of an empire. Babylon had learned, over generations, that when you conquered a nation, you did not only take its gold, you took its best minds, you took the sons of its aristocracy, and you brought them into your own court and you trained them patiently in your own language and your own literature and your own way of seeing the world. And in a generation the nation you had conquered no longer had its own future. Its own future was working for you, wearing your robes, speaking your language, serving your king. This is what the empire wanted from Daniel, not his death, his skill, not his blood, his mind. There is a particular kind of wound in being selected. It is a wound that soldiers taken in ordinary war do not always have. To be marched off in the general chaos of a defeat is one thing. To be studied, measured, weighed, chosen is another. Somewhere in the days after Nebuchadnezzar entered Jerusalem, officers came to the fine houses of the upper city with a list. They came to the house where Daniel lived, and they came to the houses of Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, and to other houses like them. They came with instructions. They came, perhaps, with courtesy. This was not a smash and grab. It was a bureaucratic act, the taking of assets for the crown. We do not know the exact words that were spoken. We do not know how Daniel's parents received them. We do not know if his mother wept openly or held her weeping until after the officers had gone. We do not know if his father stood in the courtyard and folded his arms and asked whether there was any way at all that the boy might be spared. The story is quiet about these things, and we will be quiet with it. But we can imagine. We can imagine the last morning in the house, the bag being packed, the good sandals being put on, and a second pair being wrapped and tucked away, because there was a very long walk ahead. We can imagine the prayer said at the door. We can imagine the last look up at the temple, its walls catching the light exactly as they had every other morning of the boy's life. We can imagine him walking out with the others, 4 boys and others we do not name, and older captives too, court officials, minor princes, the useful and the well-connected, being gathered together at some appointed place, perhaps outside the city, perhaps at one of the gates, perhaps in a courtyard of the palace itself, ready to be taken north. And then, at some hour on some day whose exact date is lost to us, the column began to move. 900 miles. That is the number the maps give, when you do not simply draw a straight line across the desert, but trace the route an army actually takes, the route caravans have taken for 1,000 years, up along the coastal plain, or across into the hill country, and then north, up through Syria, and then east, following the arc of the Fertile Crescent, following the rivers and the wells and the pasturage, all the way to the great bend of the Euphrates, and then down along its banks to Babylon itself. 900 miles on foot, 900 miles at the pace of a marching army with its baggage and its captives and its herds, weeks, months perhaps. The exact duration is not written, and we will not invent it. but we can walk with them a little way in our imagination, because this is the part of the story that is easily rushed past, and it should not be rushed past. The books of history like to set Daniel down in Babylon and get on with the palace and the dreams and the miracles. But before there was any of that, there was the road. There was the road, and the road did its own work on him. Consider the first day, the city receding behind him. The walls of Jerusalem walked past every day of his life, now seen from the outside from an angle he has never quite seen them at before. The temple, glimpsed above the walls, growing smaller, the last sight of the smoke of the evening sacrifice. He would not have known that it was the last time. That is a mercy the mind gives itself. He would have thought, perhaps, of return. Boys taken in tribute had been returned before in other stories. Fathers had negotiated. Kings had ransomed. He would have thought, walking those first miles, that this was terrible but not final, that there would be a coming home, that the temple was not vanishing but only receding, and would grow again in his sight when whatever bargain the men in robes had struck was fulfilled. Consider the second day, the land beginning to change, the hills of Judah giving way to the more open country of Samaria, the trees becoming different, the smell of the wind becoming different, the dialect of the villagers along the road becoming different. The road ate at the familiar in small ways, one day at a time. Consider what a boy might have carried in his head as the road unrolled beneath him. He would have carried the words of the Psalms. He would have carried the shape of the daily prayers, said in the morning and the evening, said quietly to himself as he walked because there was nothing else to hold on to. He would have carried the picture of his mother's face. He would have carried the picture of the temple. He would have carried the sound of Hebrew. The specific music of Hebrew, its consonants, its rhythms, its particular way of making a sentence. The sound that was, up to now, simply the sound of the world. And every day the road took a little of that world further away. He walked with other captives. He walked with soldiers. He walked with pack animals whose smell filled the air. He walked past villages that did not know him and did not care. He walked, eventually, out of the land the God of his fathers had promised to the tribes of Israel, and into countries whose gods were carved and painted on temple walls he did not recognize. Somewhere along the way the four boys must have leaned on each other. We're not told the words. We're not told which of them was strongest on which day, which of them wept openly, and which of them held back until the dark. But we can trust that they did lean. Four boys of the same city, walking the same road, carrying the same names, because they still had their names, at this stage, still Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah. Four small sentences about God, walking north under a foreign sky. The route curved. It followed the well-worn path of caravans and armies through the Syrian country, staying north of the great impassable desert that cuts across the interior. It rose into higher country and then descended. It found the rivers. It found eventually the Euphrates, a river greater than any river he had ever seen, wider than the Jordan, sluggish and brown and endless, with reeds along its banks and villages of mud brick clinging to its terraces and boats moving on its surface with their strange square sails. And then it turned south and followed the river, and the country flattened, and the sky opened, and the horizon became a horizon of a kind Daniel had never known, a horizon without hills, without the comfortable close shoulders of the country he'd grown up in, just the long, low line of a land laid down flat between two rivers. Somewhere in the course of that walk, perhaps early, perhaps late, perhaps in stages, the boys were given new names. We will come back to the naming, because it deserves its own careful attention. But even now, in the walking, we can feel it beginning, The old names still spoken among themselves, the new name spoken by the officers, Belteshazzar for Daniel. Bel protect his life, where Bel was the great god of Babylon, Shadrach for Hananiah, Meshach for Mishael, Abednego for Azariah, servant of Nebo, another of the Babylonian gods, every name a small sentence as before, only now the sentences were about other gods. Every time an officer called out, the empire pressed one more thumb mark onto the soft clay of the boys' identities. They were being reshaped as they walked, slowly, patiently, because empires have time. You must understand, and this is important, that this was not brutality for its own sake. This was policy. This was, in its own careful way, generosity. The boys were fed. They were kept from the worst violence. They were not chained. They were being groomed, not broken. The empire did not want their bones. It wanted their loyalty, their intelligence, their capable adult years, and it was willing to invest in feeding and clothing and educating a boy for years in order to get them. That is the particular pressure of the road. It is not the pressure of cruelty. It is the pressure of comfort, applied gently, over a very long distance. Every day, a little more distance from Jerusalem. Every day, a little more of the Babylonian tongue drifting through the camp. Every day, a little more of the smell of Mesopotamian food in the pot at evening. Every day, a little less of the accent of home in the ears. Every day, a little more of Belteshazzar and a little less of Daniel. This is how exile works, not in one blow, but in 1,000 small ones. The prophet Jeremiah, back in Jerusalem, would eventually write a letter to the exiles. He would tell them to build houses and live in them, to plant gardens and eat what they produced, to take wives, to have sons and daughters, to seek the peace of the city where they had been carried. It is a strange, difficult instruction when you consider it. Not resist, not sabotage, not sit weeping by the rivers with your harps hung in the willows, though there would be that too, and it would be recorded in another psalm. But build, plant, live, and in the living, do not forget, do not become, remain. That was the assignment. And on the road, at the age of 13 or 14, Daniel could not have known that this would be the assignment of the rest of his life. He could not have known that the road would end at the walls of a city bigger than any city he had imagined. He could not have known that inside those walls a king would set him a table, and that the food on the table would be his first test. He could not have known that beyond that test lay dreams to interpret, a furnace to survive, decades of quiet service in an empire's court, another empire rising to swallow the first, a window he would open every day toward a city that was no longer there, and finally a pit and a stone and a long silence. He knew only what any boy on any long walk knows, that his feet hurt, that the sun was hot, that his companions were beside him, that the God his parents had named him for was somehow still watching, and that behind him, growing smaller with every step, was the city he had thought would always be his home. Ahead of him, still days away, still weeks away, was Babylon, the city that wanted to be the world. And then, at last, it appeared, not all at once. First as a haze on the horizon, a smudge of pale colour where the earth met the sky, then as a shape, then as many shapes, and then, slowly, as the road bent and the caravan crested a low rise, as a vision. Babylon did not sit on the plain the way other cities sat. Babylon rose from the plain. It rose as if the plain itself had been forced to lift its shoulders and hold up something too heavy to carry. The first thing a traveller saw, from a long way off, was the ziggurat, Etemenanki. The name meant, in the old tongue of the land, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It rose in stepped tiers, 7 of them, each smaller than the last, climbing toward a sky it seemed almost close enough to touch. At its summit stood a temple, small only by comparison, gleaming in the sun. From the road, still hours away, the ziggurat looked like a mountain that had decided to become a building, or a building that had decided to become a mountain, around 300 feet high by our measures, higher than anything Daniel had ever stood beneath in Jerusalem, higher than the Temple of Solomon, which was already a memory he was struggling to hold in place, higher than the palaces of kings, higher in fact than almost anything human hands had ever built anywhere on the earth in that century. And it was only the beginning. Around the ziggurat, spreading outward, the city itself began to reveal itself in pieces. Walls, enormous walls, of a scale that seemed almost playful, as if the men who had built them had wanted, somewhere in their hearts, simply to see how big a wall could be made. Towers along the walls, evenly spaced, like a line of watchmen who never blinked. The river, threading through it all, the Euphrates, wide and slow, glinting silver in the sun. The river passed through the city, actually through it, under the walls, between the palaces, past the gardens, out again. A city built astride a river, a city that had made even the water into a servant, and beyond the walls, on the plain, a haze of movement. Roads, fields, canals, villages, traffic, everywhere, traffic, carts and camels and donkeys and men on foot, merchants with their bundles, farmers with their vegetables, priests in their long robes, soldiers, officials, the endless human churn of a place where 200,000 people had decided to live in one place at one time. For a boy who had grown up in Jerusalem, a city large by the standards of Judah, but small by any other, it was not simply impressive. It was disorienting. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of the sea for the first time and realizing that the sea does not stop. The road drew closer. The caravan slowed as it merged with other travelers, other caravans, coming in from other roads, roads from Egypt, roads from Persia, roads from Arabia and from the Mediterranean, and from the far edges of the Zagros Mountains. Every road, it seemed, led here, every road in the world, and on every road people were arriving, not just prisoners, merchants, traders, ambassadors, scholars, men in strange clothes speaking strange languages, women with veiled faces and silver bracelets, priests carrying instruments Daniel had never seen, slaves and free men and rich men and poor men and every gradation between. Babylon received them all. Babylon received everything. And now, ahead, the great gate was becoming visible. The Ishtar Gate. It would be rebuilt more magnificently a few decades later, under Nebuchadnezzar's own hand, the version that would later be pulled from the earth, piece by piece, and reassembled in a museum thousands of miles away. But even now, before that grand reconstruction, the gate was staggering. Its walls were faced in glazed brick, not painted, not tiled, glazed. Each brick fired with a coating of blue so deep and so pure that in the sun the whole surface seemed to hum. A blue like the sky at the moment just after sunset, when the day is gone but the night has not quite arrived. A blue like nothing in nature, and yet somehow like everything in nature at once. And on that blue field, marching in rhythmic rows, the animals, lions in gold striding along the lower registers, bulls in gold further up, dragons, the strange serpentine creatures sacred to the god Marduk, with the body of a snake and the paws of a lion and the tail of a scorpion, arranged along the upper courses, row upon row of them, not one lion, not one bull, dozens, Hundreds. An army of creatures made of coloured earth and fire standing perpetual guard on the approach to the city. The message was not subtle. The message was not meant to be subtle. The message was, this is the seat of the gods. This is the place the gods have chosen. If you enter here, you enter their house. If you serve here, you serve them. Daniel walked toward that gate with his companions on either side of him. He was a boy from Jerusalem. He'd grown up hearing that the Lord had chosen one place, one hill, one temple, one people. He'd grown up in a religion that made a point of being small, and now he was walking beneath a gate that was screaming in every colour it possessed that Babylon was chosen, that Marduk was chosen, that the gods of this city had won. He did not turn back. There was nowhere to turn back to. He kept walking, through the gate, under the golden animals, into the streets of the great city. Inside the walls, the city was another kind of shock. Streets straighter than any streets he'd ever seen, laid out in a grid deliberately, as if the men who planned Babylon had decided that even the ground itself should obey. Wide processional avenues, broad enough for chariots to pass 3 abreast, paved with stone. The processional way, the great street of Marduk, ran through the heart of the city, from the Ishtar Gate down toward the temple precinct. Its walls on either side were also glazed, more lions walking silently in gold and yellow along the path a visitor would take toward the ziggurat. Behind those walls, houses, districts, neighbourhoods, whole quarters given over to different trades, the metalworkers here, the weavers there, the scribes in another district where the smell of wet clay and reed pens hung in the air, the bakers where the smell was different, warmer, sweeter, markets where the produce of an empire was piled in baskets, dates, figs, grain, fish from the river, meat from the plains, wine from the north, oil from the west, spices from the east, from places whose names Daniel had never heard, and everywhere, people. Speaking Akkadian, the language of the empire, speaking Aramaic, the trade tongue of the age, speaking scraps of Persian and Elamite and Egyptian, and occasionally, from a huddle of new arrivals like Daniel's own, Hebrew. Everywhere, the noise of a city that never stopped negotiating with itself, and rising above all of it, always at the edge of vision, the ziggurat. Wherever you were in Babylon, you could see it. Look up from your work, from your bargain, from your meal, and there it was, Marduk's house, reminding you. There were said to be gardens as well, the famous gardens. Whether they existed exactly as later travellers described them, terraces upon terraces of trees and flowers watered by hidden mechanisms hanging above the courtyards of the palace, is a matter accounts differ on. Some sources speak of them in wonder, others do not mention them at all. But there were gardens, there were certainly gardens. Babylon, sitting in the middle of an irrigated plain, took its ability to grow things and made a display of it. Trees where no trees should grow, fruits ripening out of season, the scent of jasmine drifting from behind palace walls, where a boy from Jerusalem would never be permitted to walk. All of it, the gardens, the gate, the walls, the ziggurat, the palaces, the endless streets, the endless people, all of it was designed, not just built, designed. Designed to say, here is the centre, here, finally, is the world. If Jerusalem had said, we are the people the Lord has chosen, then Babylon said, we are the place everything has come to. And it was not a lie. That is the frightening thing. Babylon was not making it up. Everything had come here. The gold of the temples had come here. The vessels from Solomon's own house, those vessels seized in Jerusalem, had come here and were now sitting in a storeroom of the temple of Marduk, laid out among the vessels of 100 other conquered gods, as if to say, your God too has visited us. Your God too has sent tribute. For a boy of 13 standing in the street on his first day inside those walls, staring up at that ziggurat, breathing the smoke of 1,000 cooking fires and the incense of 100 temples, hearing a language he only partly understood spoken by people who did not know his name, or worse, who knew only the new one, it would have been very easy to conclude that his God had, in some real sense, lost. That the argument was over, that Marduk had prevailed, that the sensible thing, the reasonable thing, the wise thing, would be to bow one's head, learn the new tongue, adopt the new name, and be grateful. Many did. Many, over the coming years and decades and centuries, would. The history of exile is largely the history of people who did. Daniel did not. But, and this is the part that must be understood carefully, Daniel did not refuse to enter. He entered. He walked through the Ishtar gate. He allowed himself to be led to the compound where the boys of the training program were housed. He allowed the officials of the court to examine him, measure him, assign him quarters. He accepted the new clothes. He accepted the new food at first, though that would come to be complicated. He accepted, above all, the new name, Belteshazzar. Bel, protect his life. It was said aloud, and he answered to it. He didn't stand in the courtyard and shout that his name was Daniel, and that Bel could not protect anything, being nothing more than a lump of stone. He did not, so far as we are told, argue at all. He simply, quietly, in some deep place inside himself, kept the other name, held it, the way you might hold a small stone in your closed hand while walking through a room full of strangers. No one need see it, no one need know, but the hand knows. The hand always knows. This is a strange kind of resistance, and it deserves attention. It is not the resistance of the martyr who cries out in the square. It is not the resistance of the rebel who plots in the dark. It is not even the resistance of the exile who refuses to learn the new tongue. Daniel learned the tongue. Daniel learned the literature. Daniel would spend 3 years, 3 formative, foundational adolescent years, steeping himself in the wisdom, the astronomy, the astrology, the omen reading, the mathematics, the epics, the hymns, the legal codes, the diplomatic protocols of the Chaldean world. He would emerge at the end of those 3 years more fluent in Babylonian thought than most Babylonians. He would be, by every outward measure, a product of the program. He would be, by every outward measure, Belteshazzar. And yet, in some interior room he never let the empire enter, he would remain Daniel. God is my judge. This is the tension the whole story is going to turn on for the next 70 years. Not defiance, not withdrawal, not compromise, something else. Something for which we don't have a very good word in our own language, and which the world does not often produce examples of. An outward pliancy that conceals an inward granite. A willingness to bend on everything except the one thing. A refusal to make a scene about what does not matter, so that when the moment comes that does matter, the refusal has weight. There is a note in the old commentaries that touches on this, that Daniel and his friends did not choose to make an issue of the names, that he recognized that if they fought every battle, they would win none, that some ground had to be given in order that other ground could be held, that there was a difference, a subtle life or death difference, between adaptation and assimilation. Adaptation is what a plant does when it grows in a new soil. It sends its roots differently, it turns its leaves to a different sun, but it remains, root and stem and seed, the plant it was. Assimilation is what happens when the plant is ground up and becomes soil for something else. Daniel would adapt. Daniel would not assimilate. And so, When the officer called out Belteshazzar, Daniel would answer, because the officer was calling him, and he was, in fact, being called. But when he prayed, later, in the quiet of his own room, at his window, 3 times a day, as he would come to do, and as we will come to, he would not pray to Bel. He would pray to the God who had judged him worthy to remember his own name, and the God who had judged him worthy would, over the long years, judge him worthy again and again. But that is later. For now, we're in the training compound. For now, the 4 boys have been given quarters. They have been given robes, good ones, embroidered, suited to their new station. They have been given tutors, the best tutors in the city, priests of the temple, scholars of the tablet house, men whose beards were long and whose knowledge was longer. They have been given above all a schedule, wake at dawn, wash, prayers, to Marduk, to Nabu, to the tutelary gods of the palace. The 4 boys presumably stood among the others. We're not told whether they moved their lips. Instruction, the copying of tablets, the memorizing of hymns, the tracing of the stars, meals, more instruction, physical training perhaps, instruction in etiquette, in court procedure, in the correct way to address a chamberlain, a general, a governor, a king, sleep, and then again, at dawn, days piling onto days, weeks onto weeks, the scaffolding of a new self being built around them, board by board, and then, at some point in those early days, the food arrived. The king's food. This is a small thing in the grand history of empires. The king's kitchen produced every day vast quantities of food, the best food in the empire, meat from the finest herds, wine from the finest vineyards, bread from the whitest flour, fruit from the palace orchards. A portion of this food was, by royal command, sent to the boys in training. It was not stinting, it was not punishment, it was the opposite of punishment. It was the king's own table. To eat from the king's table was, in the ancient world, a mark of the highest favour. It meant you were, in some ceremonial sense, the king's dependent, his household, under his protection, nourished by his hand. A boy taken from a subjugated province and given to eat from Nebuchadnezzar's own kitchen was, by the standards of the age, being enormously honoured. The food would have been beautiful. Roasted meats, seasoned with cumin and coriander and other spices from the caravan routes, stews of lamb and lentils, fish from the river, grilled with olive oil, bread still warm from the oven, dates, figs, honey, cheese, cream, and wine, good wine from the royal cellars, poured into cups that a boy from Jerusalem would have considered fit only for a temple. It was placed before them. And Daniel, this is where the pivot comes, and it comes so quietly you could almost miss it, Daniel resolved. That is the word the old text uses, resolved. He did not shout, he did not weep, he did not knock the plate away. He resolved, in his own heart, in his own private counsel with himself, he decided not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. Why? The text does not say precisely. The commentators, over the centuries, have offered several possibilities. The food may have violated the dietary laws of his people. Pork, perhaps, or meat from which the blood had not been properly drained, or animals that were, in the categories of his tradition, unclean. The food may have been offered first to the gods of Babylon before being served, a common practice in the palace kitchens where every meal began with a sacrifice, so that to eat it would be, in a real sense, to eat what had been given first to Marduk. The food may simply have been, by its very nature as the king's food, a form of covenant. To eat regularly at another man's table in the ancient Near East was to enter into a bond with him. You did not eat the bread of a man and then betray him. You did not drink the wine of a king and then refuse him your loyalty. To accept the food day after day was to be pledged. And Daniel, though he had accepted the name, though he had accepted the schooling, though he had accepted 100 smaller things, Daniel would not be pledged, not to this table. He had another table to which he was already pledged, a table set, invisibly, somewhere behind him, in a city that was no longer his. So he resolved. And then, and this is what makes the story what it is, he acted with tact. He did not confront the king. He did not go to Ashpenaz, the chief official, and demand. He asked. He asked, we are told, that he might not defile himself. Just that. Not, I refuse. Not, your food is unclean. Not, your gods are false. Simply, permission, please, not to defile myself. And the record adds a strange, tender detail, that God gave Daniel favour and compassion in the eyes of Ashpenaz. The official listened. The official was, this is remarkable to consider, kindly disposed toward this boy. But the official was also afraid. He explained, with what one imagines was some awkwardness, that if the boys grew thin and pale on their special diet, if they appeared before the king less flourishing than the others, it would be his head. Literally, his head. The king had commanded the food. The king expected results. A soft-hearted chief official could be a dead chief official very quickly in Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. Daniel understood. Daniel did not argue. Daniel proposed instead an experiment. 10 days. Just 10 days. For 10 days let us eat vegetables and drink water. At the end of the 10 days compare us to the others. If we look worse, do with us as you will. We will return to the food. We will not protest. The chief official, or the steward under him in some versions, agreed. It was a small enough concession. 10 days is not long. If the boys withered, the experiment ended. The boys returned to the royal fare, and the official's neck was safe. If the boys thrived, well, that would be a different problem, and one to be dealt with later. So it began. 10 days. Vegetables, we're told, and water. The Hebrew word behind vegetables suggests something broader. Pulses, grains, the produce of the ground. Not a starvation diet, but a plain one, the kind of food a boy might have eaten in a modest household in Jerusalem before the world had changed. Familiar food, food that did not smell of the palace, food that had not been laid first at the feet of a foreign god. For 10 days the 4 boys ate their pulses, they drank their water, they studied their tablets, they learned their Akkadian verbs, they memorized their hymns, they stood in their appointed places at the appointed hours, they did all of it. They gave the empire everything the empire asked for except this one thing, and on the 11th day we're told they were examined, and their faces were healthier than the faces of the boys who'd eaten the king's food, their bodies better nourished, their eyes clearer. The steward, whoever he was, looking at them in the morning light of that 11th day, must have felt a small, strange chill, because he would have understood immediately what this meant. It meant that the king's food was not, in fact, essential. It meant that these 4 could keep their diet. It meant, though he could not yet have known how far it would go, that these 4 were going to be, for the rest of their lives, a small, immovable point in an empire built on movement. And so the arrangement continued, the vegetables continued, the water continued. Somewhere in the palace kitchens, a portion of the king's meat and wine that had been intended for 4 boys was quietly diverted elsewhere. No one made a proclamation. No one signed a decree. The empire went on as it had gone on, but something small had happened. Something the empire had not planned for. A quiet administrative refusal transacted between a boy and a bureaucrat over a period of 10 days, involving no drama, no confrontation, no scene, only a resolution and a request and a trial and a result. This was the template. This is how Daniel would live for the next 70 years. He would not stand on the walls and shout. He would not sabotage the granaries. He would not raise an army. He would go to work. He would learn what he was asked to learn. He would do what he was asked to do. He would serve faithfully, competently, brilliantly. And on the one small thing, on the specific thing that touched the specific place where his identity actually lived, he would, courteously, immovably, decline. May I not defile myself? That would be the sentence over and over in 100 forms for a lifetime. May I not? Please. And in that phrasing, that small, careful, respectful phrasing, was hidden a strength that would outlast the man who had built the Ishtar Gate. That would outlast the empire that had brought Daniel to the gate in the first place. That would outlast in the end everything. But that is the story of the next 69 years. For now the boys have eaten their vegetables. The trial has ended. They are by all accounts well, and the tutors are calling them back to their tablets. And beyond the compound walls the great city hums on, indifferent, magnificent, sure of itself. And the boy who's called Belteshazzar, and who answers to the name, closes his eyes for a moment in the morning light, and remembers, without saying it aloud, that his name is Daniel, and that God is his judge. The 3 years of training pass the way. Long years always pass in a young life, slowly at first, then somewhere in the middle, without anyone noticing exactly when, they begin to move faster. There is a rhythm to it now. The boys rise before the light. They wash. They dress in the linen the empire has provided. They walk the corridors they once found bewildering and now find ordinary. They take their places at the low tables where the tablets are laid out. They read, they copy, they recite. The tutors who 3 years ago had watched them with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, watch them now with something closer to professional pride. These 4 are quick. These 4 are quiet. These 4 do not make trouble. They learn what they're given to learn, and they learn it more thoroughly than the tutors expected. The Akkadian that had felt like stones in their mouths in the first months now falls from their tongues as easily as their own Hebrew. They read the cuneiform without straining. They recognize the signs for a king, for a star, for river, for offering. They know the names of the great scribes of the past. They know the shapes of the constellations as the Babylonians drew them, though they still, in the private hours of the night, remember the constellations as their fathers had named them. They study the omen texts, the long lists of what a comet means, what a 2-headed lamb means, what the flight of birds across the moon means. They do not have to believe these things to memorize them, and they memorize them. They learn the hymns to Marduk. They learn the litanies to Nabu, the god of scribes, whose stylus is said to write the fates of men. They stand in the halls when the priests process by, and they bow their heads at the appropriate moments, and they do not, in any way the tutors can see, distinguish themselves from the other boys. Only in the smallest matters, a plate quietly refused, a cup quietly set aside, does the private line hold. And no one asks about the plate any more. The arrangement has become invisible. The kitchens know, the stewards know, no one else needs to know. The 3 years end, as such years always end in an examination. Not a written examination, though there are those too. The final examination is the king. Nebuchadnezzar has been at war, and Nebuchadnezzar has been at building, and Nebuchadnezzar has been at the endless business of ruling an empire that stretches from the mountains of the north to the sands of the south. But at the appointed hour he comes. He sits in his hall. He receives the boys one by one, and in small groups, and he asks them questions. The questions are not scripted. He is not looking for memorized answers. He is looking for the shape of a mind. He is looking for the kind of intelligence that will be useful to him in a decade, in 2 decades, when these boys are men, and his empire has grown into what he intends it to grow into. He is a builder. He builds walls, and he builds towers, and he builds administrations. He needs, as every builder needs, good material. The boys come before him. Some he dismisses quickly, some he holds for longer. And when Daniel and his 3 companions come before him, the 4 who have been eating vegetables and water for 3 years, the 4 whose faces the steward once found unaccountably healthier than the others, the king holds them longer than any of the rest. He asks Daniel a question. Daniel answers. He asks another. Daniel answers. The king asks something about a text that few of the boys have been given. Daniel answers as though he's been thinking about it for a long time. The king turns to Hananiah, who is now called Shadrach, and asks a question of him. Hananiah answers. He turns to Mishael, who is now called Meshach. Mishael answers. He turns to Azariah, who is now called Abednego. Azariah answers. And the king, who has heard many wise men in his life, and who is himself no fool, sits back in his seat and looks at these 4 boys, no longer quite boys, 16 years old perhaps, on the edge of manhood, in the linen of the palace, with the composure of men twice their age. And he sees what has been growing in his own house without his knowledge. The record we have puts it plainly. The king found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. 10 times. It is a Hebrew way of speaking, and one should not measure it too literally. But the meaning is unmistakable. They were not merely competent. They were not merely well-trained. They were, in the estimation of the man who had summoned every wise man in the East to his court, superior to the whole assembled apparatus of Babylonian learning. And so they entered royal service, not as slaves, not as scribes copying inventories in some back room, as advisers, as young men who would stand from that day forward close to the throne, assigned quarters improved, the robes changed. The tablets they now handled were not exercises but real matters, reports from provinces, letters from ambassadors, records of tribute, questions of law. The men they sat beside in the council chambers were greybeards who had served Nebuchadnezzar's father, and these greybeards, some of them, must have looked at the 4 Judean boys with a certain hardness in their eyes, because they knew, as courtiers always know, that a favourite of the king is a threat to everyone else's favour. But Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah did not push. They did not press. They took the seats they were given and did the work they were assigned. They learned the names of the greybeards. They learned which of them had suffered which losses, and which of them had which allegiances, and which of them could be trusted and which could not. They learned the geography of the court the way, as boys, they had learned the geography of the palace corridors, slowly, patiently, without drawing attention to the learning. And in the ordinary rhythms of that court over months and years, they became simply part of it, not conspicuous, not resented, not for the most part even noticed, simply present, simply useful. The bureaucracy of Babylon in those years was a vast and intricate machine. The city itself had grown into the largest in the world. The population pressed against its walls. The Euphrates running through its middle carried barges of grain from the south and stone from the north and cedar from the west. The processional way, paved with limestone slabs the width of a house, ran from the Ishtar Gate down toward the great temple complex, and along it moved the daily traffic of an empire. Priests, soldiers, merchants, foreign envoys in strange clothes speaking strange languages, all of them coming in the end to the same city, the same king, the same throne. The palace administered all of it. There were officials for the tribute that came in from Tyre, and officials for the tribute that came in from the Philistine coast, and officials for the tribute that came in from Egypt when Egypt was paying, and officials for the messages that had to be sent to the governors of the provinces, and officials for the granaries, and officials for the courts, and officials for the temples, and officials for the astronomers, and officials for the armourers, and officials for the horse trainers, and officials for the boat builders on the river. And above all these officials sat a smaller circle of men close to the king. And in that smaller circle, before he had turned 20, sat Daniel. He did not shout about it. He did not write home about it, and even if he had, there was no home to write to. Jerusalem was still there, still standing at this stage, but the road between them was a road of 1,000 miles, and a border that was not to be crossed. He simply did the work. Each morning he rose. Each morning he prayed, not in the way the priests of Marduk prayed, not with the long litanies and the sprinkling of oils, but simply as he had been taught as a child, facing a certain direction, saying certain words that he had known since before he could remember not knowing them. Each morning he ate his plain food. Each morning he dressed in the robes appropriate to his station. Each morning he went out into the machinery of the empire and turned the small wheel that had been given to him to turn. And each evening he came back, for years, for quiet, uninterrupted years. This is the part of the story that gets lost, because the dramatic scenes are what people remember. The furnace, the lions, the writing on the wall. But between those scenes were years, long years, decades in the aggregate, of ordinary faithful work, meetings, reports, reviews of tax assessments from distant provinces, interpretations of letters written in dialects no one else at the court could read, consultations with generals about supply routes, consultations with priests about calendar reforms, consultations with foreign ambassadors about the price of copper, the long, unspectacular and quietly consequential work of a man who is good at his job and who is trusted to do it. The paradox of Daniel's middle years is that he was, in every measurable sense, a Babylonian success story. He'd been brought to the city as a captive. He'd been given the education of a Babylonian nobleman. He had risen, on merit, to a place of influence. He served the empire that had destroyed his home, and he served it well, not grudgingly, not with hidden sabotage, not with any suggestion, in any of the accounts, that he ever gave less than his full attention and his full skill to the tasks assigned him. When the king asked for wisdom, Daniel gave wisdom. When the king asked for judgment, Daniel gave judgment. He did not withhold. He did not sulk. He didn't perform his exile with visible bitterness. And yet, in the mornings, he prayed toward Jerusalem, and in the evenings he prayed toward Jerusalem. And when the food came from the king's table, it went past him, and when the hymns to Marduk were sung, his lips did not shape the words. And when he was called Belteshazzar, he answered, but somewhere inside him, quietly, without display, another name kept its place. This is not a contradiction. This is what integrity actually looks like when it has to live somewhere. It is not the refusal to serve. It is the refusal to be owned. He served the king with everything he had. He belonged to no one but God. And the empire, which had 1,000 tools for making men forget who they were, the renaming, the retraining, the promotions, the rewards, the elaborate machinery of belonging, the empire found in this one young Judean that its tools did not work, not through defiance, through something quieter and stranger, through simple, daily, unremarkable persistence. He kept praying. He kept eating simply. He kept remembering his name. And after a while, the machinery, which had assumed it would eventually absorb everyone, stopped noticing that it had failed to absorb him. He was too useful to bother about. The years passed. The city changed around him. Nebuchadnezzar's building projects continued one after another in a burst of construction unmatched in the ancient world. New temples rose, old ones were refurbished, the great walls were reinforced and heightened. The palace itself grew, new wings, new gardens, new audience halls faced with glazed brick and cedar. Somewhere in these years the hanging gardens took the shape by which they would later be remembered, though what exactly they were, and where exactly they were, and whether they existed in the form the later Greek writers described remains uncertain. What is certain is that Babylon in the middle years of Nebuchadnezzar was a city that behaved as though it would last forever. The bricks were stamped with his name, the gates were named for his gods, the processions moved through the streets on the appointed days, and the priests carried the images of Marduk and Nabu and Ishtar, and the people bowed, and the incense rose, and the empire believed in itself with the completeness of an empire at its height. And in an office not far from the throne room, a young Judean advisor worked through a stack of dispatches from the western provinces, and did his job, and did it well, and thought his own thoughts, which no one asked him to share. Then, in the second year of the reign, and the dating here is one of the details that scholars have puzzled over, because it seems too early for Daniel to have already completed his 3 years, and various explanations have been offered, and no one is entirely sure. But at some point in the early years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, the king had a dream. He had many dreams. Kings do. But this one was different. This one woke him in the night, and he could not go back to sleep, and in the morning he could not shake the feeling of it. Something had been shown to him, something enormous, something that concerned not only him, but the whole shape of the future, the whole arc of what was to come after him. He remembered the feeling with a terrible clarity, but the dream itself, the images, the sequence, the details, the dream itself would not come. It slipped away from him the way dreams do, leaving only the residue, the certainty that it had mattered, and this was intolerable to him. He summoned the wise men, all of them, the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, the astrologers, the whole apparatus of Babylonian divination, which was one of the most elaborate in the ancient world. They came. They stood before him in their robes and their insignia. They waited to be told the dream, as had always been the custom, so that they could interpret it. And the king said something that had never been said before in that hall. He said, "Tell me the dream. Tell me first what I dreamed, and then tell me what it means." The wise men, at first, thought they had misunderstood. They asked him politely to repeat. He repeated, "Tell me the dream." They protested. They said, "There is no man on earth who can do this." They said, "No king, however great, has ever asked such a thing of his advisers." They said, "Only the gods can reveal what is in another man's dream, and the gods do not dwell among men." They were correct. By their own theology, they were entirely correct. The gods dwelt in the temples and spoke through omens, and could be consulted through the liver of a sheep or the flight of a bird. But they did not enter the mind of a man in the middle of the night, and then explain themselves in the morning to a room full of scholars. What the king was asking was impossible, and the king knew it was impossible. That was the point. He had understood, somewhere in the terror of that dream, that the ordinary machinery of interpretation would not be enough. Anyone could interpret a dream that was told to them. Any clever man could construct a plausible reading from a set of images. He did not want a plausible reading. He wanted to know that whoever interpreted this dream had actually seen it, was actually connected in some real and terrible way to whatever had spoken it. And so he set a test that no one could pass, or rather, no one that he already knew. The wise men could not tell him. They tried. They begged. They offered him every rhetorical strategy they had. He was not moved. In his rage, and the rage of an Eastern king in the fullness of his power is not a small thing, he ordered them all executed. All of them. The whole assembly. Every magician, every enchanter, every astrologer in Babylon. And the order went out. The executioner, whose name the record gives as Arioch, began to gather them. And in the gathering, in the sweep of the decree that took in every wise man in the city, Daniel was included. He was by now counted among them. He had graduated from the training program. He had entered royal service. He was, in the eyes of the empire's bureaucracy, one of the wise men of Babylon, whether he had ever sought that classification or not. Arioch came for him. The account tells us Daniel spoke to Arioch with wisdom and tact, not with panic, not with pleading. He asked what the matter was. He was told. He asked for time. He went to the king, went quite directly to the king, though he was young, and though the king was in the kind of rage that had already condemned the most senior scholars in the empire. And he asked for time, just time, enough time to seek the answer. And the king, for reasons the record does not explain but which perhaps have to do with the memory of that first examination 3 years before, the memory of these 4 young Judeans who had answered his questions better than any of the greybeards, the king granted it. And Daniel went home, to the quarters he shared with his 3 companions, to Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, to Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, if you prefer their court names, though in the privacy of that room, on that night, they would have used the names their mothers had given them. He told them what had happened. He told them what had been asked. He told them that all the wise men of Babylon were under sentence of death, and that they, being counted among the wise men, were under it too. And they did the thing they had learned to do together, over years of small quiet fidelities in a foreign city. They prayed, not aloud in the streets, not with sackcloth and ashes in the temple squares, in their own room, the 4 of them, through the night. We're not told the words, we're not told the posture, we're not told whether they wept, or whether they were silent, or whether they took turns, or whether they spoke together. We are told only that they prayed, and that they asked God for mercy, and that they asked him to reveal the mystery, so that they would not perish with the wise men of Babylon. It is one of the quietest scenes in the whole book. 4 young men in a room in a foreign city, kneeling, asking. Around them, a metropolis of 200,000 people, most of them asleep. Above them, the great ziggurat of Etemenanki, rising into the darkness in its 7 tiers. Below them, the Euphrates moving through the city in its endless indifferent flow. And in the middle of all of this, in a plain room with a plain lamp burning, 4 voices, or one voice repeated 4 times, asking the God of a defeated people to speak. And in the night, the answer came. The record does not describe how it came, whether in a dream of Daniel's own, whether in a vision, whether in a slow arrival of understanding as they prayed, only that it came. And when the morning arrived, Daniel knew what the king had dreamed, and he knew what it meant. He rose, he washed, he dressed. He went to Arioch, who was still, presumably, in the grim business of gathering the condemned. He told Arioch to stop. He told Arioch to take him to the king, and Arioch, who had perhaps not expected this to work, but who could recognize when something unusual was happening, brought him. Daniel stood before Nebuchadnezzar. He was still quite young, perhaps not yet 20, perhaps not much older. Before him sat the most powerful man in the world at that hour, in a rage that had already condemned the entire academic class of the empire, waiting to hear whether this young Judean was going to give him what none of the greybeards could give. Daniel spoke carefully. He began, the record tells us, by naming the source. He said, "There is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, not I, not my wisdom, not the training I have received in your schools. There is a God, and he has shown the king what will be in the latter days." And then he told him the dream. He described the statue, enormous, terrifying to look at, the head of the finest gold, the chest and the arms of silver, the belly and the thighs of bronze, the legs of iron, the feet part iron and part clay mingled together, the strength of the one refusing to bind with the brittleness of the other. And then Daniel said, the king had seen a stone cut, not by human hands, out of a mountain. The stone struck the statue at its feet, at the place where the iron and the clay had failed to bind, and the whole enormous thing had come down, the iron and the clay together, and then the bronze, and then the silver, and then the gold, all of it broken to pieces at once, the pieces so fine that they became like the chaff on a summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away, and no trace of them was found. And the stone that had struck the statue grew. It became a mountain. It filled the whole earth. That was the dream. Nebuchadnezzar heard it, and what he heard, he recognized. The record does not describe his face at this moment, but we can imagine it, because Daniel was not guessing. Daniel was not offering one of 100 plausible reconstructions. Daniel was telling the king what he had actually seen in the interior of his own mind on a night when he had woken alone and had not been able to name what had shaken him. And then Daniel gave the interpretation. The head of gold, he said, is you, Nebuchadnezzar, king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, the glory. You are the head of gold. But after you will arise another kingdom, inferior to yours, the silver, and after that another, the bronze, and after that a fourth, strong as iron, crushing, breaking, shattering all that came before it, and then, at the end, a divided kingdom, partly strong, partly brittle, iron and clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. The stone, cut without hands, growing, filling everything. The empires of men, Daniel said, will rise and fall one after another in their order, in their appointed times. But there is another kingdom coming, not built by men, not maintained by armies, not resting on the fortunes of any dynasty, a kingdom that will outlast the gold and the silver and the bronze and the iron and clay together, a kingdom that will fill the earth. And when Daniel had finished, there was silence in the hall, and then Nebuchadnezzar, the builder of Babylon, the master of the world at that hour, the man whose name was stamped into every brick of every wall of every temple he had raised, Nebuchadnezzar rose from his throne, and he came down, and he did something no ancient king was ever recorded doing before a captive from a defeated province. He bowed, he fell on his face before Daniel, he ordered offerings to be made. He said, "Truly, your God is the God of gods, and the Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries." He made Daniel ruler over the whole province of Babylon. He made him chief over all the wise men of the empire, and at Daniel's request he appointed Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah to positions of authority in the administration of the province, while Daniel himself remained at the king's court. The wise men were not executed. The order was lifted. The greybeards returned to their studies, some of them, one imagines, with a new and complicated feeling about the young Judean who had done what none of them could do. And Daniel walked out of that hall into the corridors he had known since boyhood, no longer a junior advisor, but a chief. And the empire, which had been designed to absorb him, found itself, in the person of its king, kneeling before the God he had refused to forget. That night, one supposes, he ate his ordinary food, and he prayed his ordinary prayer, and he faced, as he had always faced, the direction of Jerusalem, and the great city of Babylon moved on around him in its magnificence, in its certainty of itself, in the confident hum of an empire that did not yet know it was only the head of gold. And so the years began to accumulate, not in dramatic strokes, not in the sudden reversals that later readers would remember and retell, but in the slow, ordinary way that years accumulate in the life of a man who has decided once and does not need to decide again. Daniel served, and Nebuchadnezzar reigned, and the reign was long, 43 years from beginning to end, a span longer than most lives in the ancient world, a span in which children grew to become fathers, and fathers grew to become old men, and old men were carried out to the burial grounds beyond the walls. Nebuchadnezzar reigned through all of it. He was the fixed point around which the empire turned, and Daniel, in his quieter orbit, was there through all of it too, through the campaigns, through the tributes, through the ambassadors arriving from Tyre and from Sidon, and from the cities of the Philistines with their gifts and their careful words, through the seasons when the Euphrates ran high and the seasons when it ran low, through the great feast days of Marduk, when the processional way filled with priests and the smoke of incense rose so thick that the glazed lions of the Ishtar gate seemed to move behind it. Daniel was present for all of it, and through all of it, he was doing the small thing he had always done. He was rising in the morning. He was going to the window. He was kneeling. He was speaking in Hebrew quietly to a God whose temple in Jerusalem still stood in these years, though it would not always stand. He was giving thanks. And then he was going out to his work in the court. The court of Nebuchadnezzar in these decades was one of the most sophisticated administrative machines the ancient world had yet produced. It managed grain from the fields of Sumer. It managed timber from the cedars of Lebanon. It managed the movement of armies and the setting of taxes and the appointment of governors and the collection of tribute from 100 vassal states. And within that machine, Daniel rose. He was already chief of the wise men, Over the years, he became something more than that. He became one of the fixed voices of the palace, a man consulted before decisions were made, a man whose opinion was known to be measured, unhurried, unafraid to be quiet when he had nothing to say. He aged inside those walls. His beard, which had come in dark, began to show its first threads of grey. And Nebuchadnezzar, watching him from the throne, kept him close. It is one of the strangest features of the whole story, this bond between the king and the Judean advisor. Nebuchadnezzar had every reason to distrust him. Daniel was a foreigner, a former captive, a follower of a defeated god from a defeated city. He had refused the king's food. He had refused the king's names in his heart, even while he answered to Belteshazzar in the corridors. He belonged, by every measurable category, to the world Nebuchadnezzar had conquered. And yet the king kept him, consulted him, elevated him, called for him in the middle of the night when he could not sleep. There was something in Daniel that Nebuchadnezzar could not quite look away from, and there was perhaps something in Nebuchadnezzar too, some flicker of hunger for a truth he could not build with bricks, that kept turning back toward the God whose name Daniel would not stop speaking. But turning back is not the same as staying, and the pattern that emerged over these long years is one of the most human things in the whole book. Nebuchadnezzar would encounter the God of Israel. He would be shaken, he would bow, he would issue decrees, he would proclaim, in words that seemed for a moment to mean everything, "Truly, your God is the God of gods." And then, in the morning, he would go back to his temples. He would go back to Marduk. He would go back to the certainties that had built him. The encounters did not accumulate in him the way they accumulated in Daniel. They were events, storms that passed. He would remember them the way a man remembers a fever, and then he would return to the work of being the king of the world. Daniel served through all of it, serving a king who half believed him, serving a king who kept forgetting, serving in a court that alternately honoured his God and celebrated its own. And the peculiar loneliness of that position, being the one man in the palace for whom the encounter had not passed, that loneliness must have shaped him in ways the record does not name. He would have grown patient, he would have grown quiet, he would have learned to hold the long view. He would have learned that a king's proclamation on one evening is not the same as a king's life, and that the life is the thing that matters. And he would have learned to keep going to the window in the morning regardless. And the city around him grew. Nebuchadnezzar was a builder. It was perhaps the deepest thing about him, deeper even than his campaigns. He wanted Babylon to be beautiful. He wanted it to be the wonder of the world. Under his direction the walls thickened, the temples multiplied, the ziggurat was refaced, the processional way was extended. And according to the traditions that would later reach the Greek historians, he built for one of his queens, a woman from the highlands who missed the green of her homeland, the terraced gardens that would come to be called the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Tier upon tier of planted terraces, watered by some system of raised channels, so that from the plain below one saw a hill of green flowering out of the desert, an impossible hill, a hill that was not there yesterday, growing above the flat brown of the Mesopotamian floodplain. Whether the gardens were exactly as the later stories described them, no one now can say, but something like them stood, and the impression they left on those who saw them was such that they entered legend and did not leave. Nebuchadnezzar walked those gardens. He walked the roof of his palace high above the city and looked out, and what he saw was his. All of it was his. The walls were his, the temples were his, the gardens were his, The Euphrates itself running through his city was in some sense his. He had made this. And the pride of a man who has made a great thing is one of the oldest and most understandable pressures in the human heart. It presses at everyone who builds. It pressed at him. And then, one night, in the palace where he had by now grown old, he dreamed again. And again the dream shook him. And again he sent for Daniel, Belteshazzar, chief of the wise men, because he had learned, over the decades, that there was one man in his empire who could tell him what his dreams meant. This second dream was different from the first. In the first, Daniel had had to name the dream itself. In this one, the king remembered every image. He described it. There was a tree, he said, a tree in the middle of the earth, and its height was great. It grew, and it strengthened until its top reached to heaven, and its sight to the end of the earth. Its leaves were fair, its fruit was abundant. In it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heavens dwelt in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. And then, in the dream, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. And he cried aloud, and he said, "Cut down the tree, cut off its branches, shake off its leaves, scatter its fruit. Let the beasts get out from under it, and the birds from its branches. But leave the stump of its roots in the earth. Bind it with a band of iron and bronze. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven. Let its portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let its heart be changed from a man's, and let a beast's heart be given to it, and let 7 times pass over it." Nebuchadnezzar told the dream, and then he waited, and Daniel, when he heard it, was silent. The record says that he was appalled, that his thoughts alarmed him, that he stood there for perhaps an hour before he could speak, because he had loved this king in his own careful way across a lifetime of service, and he did not want to say what he now had to say. Nebuchadnezzar saw the trouble in his face, and he said gently, unusually gently for him, "My lord, let the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies, meaning do not soften it, say it. Even if it is against me, say it." And Daniel said it. "The tree," he said, "is you. You have grown and become strong. Your greatness has reached to heaven, and your dominion to the end of the earth. But this is the decree of the Most High that has come upon my lord the king. You will be driven from among men. Your dwelling will be with the beasts of the field. You will be made to eat grass like an ox. You will be wet with the dew of heaven, and 7 times will pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he will. The command to leave the stump, that is mercy. Your kingdom will be preserved for you from the time you know that heaven rules." And then he added, and one can hear in the addition the affection of a man who has served this king for 40 years, "Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may be a lengthening of your tranquility. Break it off. Turn. There may still be time." This was Daniel, speaking not as an interpreter of dreams, but as an old friend, if one can even use such a word across the vast gulf of station between them, giving the king one last quiet counsel from the place beside the throne he had held for so long. 12 months passed, a year in which nothing happened. The dream, one supposes, faded, the way dreams do, the way the encounters had always faded in Nebuchadnezzar. And then, at the end of those 12 months, the king was walking on the roof of his palace. He was looking out over his city, and he said aloud, whether to himself or to whoever was near him, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power, for the honor of my majesty?" And while the word was still in the king's mouth, the voice fell from heaven. "The kingdom," it said, "has departed from you." What happened next, the biblical record describes in terms that have puzzled scholars for centuries. Nebuchadnezzar was driven from human society. He lived for what the text calls 7 times, most often understood as 7 years, like a beast. He ate grass like an ox. His body was wet with the dew of heaven. His hair grew long and matted until it was compared to the feathers of eagles. His nails, uncut, became like the claws of birds. Some who have read the account have suggested a specific medical condition, a form of lycanthropy or clinical delusion, or the melancholic madness that sometimes takes hold in the aging brain of a powerful man who has never been contradicted. Others have read it as a literary portrait, a theological image of what pride, followed all the way to its end, looks like from the outside. A man who thought he was more than a man, reduced to less than one. Contemporary Babylonian records do not describe this episode. There is a silence in the chronicles for parts of Nebuchadnezzar's late reign that some have found suggestive and others have found simply inconclusive. What the Book of Daniel gives us is not a medical file. It gives us the ark. It gives us the shape. It gives us the king who said, "Is not this great Babylon which I have built?" and who then, for 7 long turnings of the seasons, was not a king at all. And where was Daniel in those years? The record does not say, but we can imagine. Because Daniel was chief of the wise men. He was one of the senior administrators of the empire. And when the king was gone, not dead, but gone, absent, wandering somewhere in the fields or the wild grounds outside the city, kept alive by whoever had been charged with keeping him alive, watched over quietly, waiting. Someone had to hold the empire together. Someone had to keep the grain moving and the taxes coming in, and the garrisons paid and the vassal states from sensing weakness and rising up. Someone had to protect the throne itself, and the possibility that the king might return to it. And whoever those men were, Daniel was among them. The record does not describe his role in this interval, but it is very hard to imagine those 7 years passing in the palace where he had served for decades without his hand steady somewhere on the machine. He would have gone on being what he had been. He would have risen in the morning. He would have gone to the window. He would have knelt. He would have prayed for the king who had once bowed before him and who was now somewhere out beyond the walls eating grass. And at the end of the 7 times Nebuchadnezzar lifted his eyes to heaven. That is the phrase the record uses. Lifted his eyes, not down at the grass, not out at the horizon, up. And his reason returned to him, and he came back to his palace, and his counselors and his lords sought him out, and his majesty was restored, and he issued then the strangest decree ever preserved from a Babylonian king, a decree that reads not like a proclamation, but like a testimony. "I, Nebuchadnezzar," he wrote, "lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing. He does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?' Those who walk in pride," he said, "at the end, those who walk in pride he is able to humble." It is one of the most remarkable passages in the entire ancient record. A king, in his own voice, saying, "I was proud, and I was humbled, and I was right to be humbled. There is nothing else quite like it from the world of the great Mesopotamian monarchs, and whether one reads it as literal royal proclamation or as testimony preserved in another form, the shape of what it describes is unmistakable. The king who had once said, "Is not this great Babylon which I have built?" had come back from wherever the 7 times had taken him, and had come back different. He had encountered at last, in a way that stayed with him, the God whom Daniel had served in silence beside him for 40 years, and then, not long after, he died. The record does not narrate his death, it simply passes it. He had reigned 43 years. He had built the walls and the temples and the gardens. He had destroyed Jerusalem in a campaign the book of Daniel does not dwell on, but which shaped everything. The temple burned, the walls broken, the last of the Judean nobility marched into exile in a second and larger deportation. He had, in his own strange half-turnings, come nearer to the God of Israel than any Gentile king before him, and he had gone, and Babylon after him began almost at once to unravel. The empire that Nebuchadnezzar had held together by sheer force of personality passed to his son, and his son did not hold it long. There was murder, there was intrigue. There were short reigns and shorter memories. Kings came to the throne and were removed. The great machine of the palace, which had run so steadily for 4 decades, began to stutter. And through all of it, Daniel remained. He was old now, 60, then 65, then 70. His hair was white, his step, one imagined, slower than it had been. But he rose in the morning, and he went to the window, and he knelt, and he faced the direction of Jerusalem, which was no longer a city now, in any real sense, but a ruin, a burned-out place, its temple broken, its inhabitants scattered across the empires and the wilderness. He faced it anyway, because the God he prayed to was still the God of that ruined city, and because he had made his practice long before the ruin, and he was not going to alter his practice because of it. The kings changed, the throne shifted from one hand to another, and eventually, after the short reigns and the murders and the compromises, the crown came to rest on a man named Nabonidus. Nabonidus was an unusual figure. He was a king who did not much like Babylon. His devotions were oriented not toward Marduk but toward the moon god Sin, whose great temple stood elsewhere. And for reasons that historians still debate, Nabonidus spent long stretches of his reign away from the capital, in the oasis city of Tamar, far to the south, in the deserts of Arabia. In his absence he left the government of Babylon in the hands of his son, a young man, a prince, named Belshazzar. Belshazzar ruled as co-regent in the great city for more than a decade. He was, in every functional sense, the king of Babylon for those years, even though the crown itself remained officially with his father in Arabia. He held the court, he gave the audiences, he commanded the garrisons, and he grew up, one may suppose, having heard the stories of Nebuchadnezzar and of the God of the Judeans, and of the old man with the white beard who still, somehow, served at the palace after all these years. But hearing the stories is not the same as being marked by them, and Belshazzar was a man of his own generation, a man for whom Nebuchadnezzar was already history, a man for whom the encounters of 40 years past were tales told by old servants. Outside the walls, meanwhile, the world was changing again. To the east and to the north, a new power had been rising. The Medes and the Persians, under a young king named Cyrus, had been gathering strength for years. They had absorbed kingdom after kingdom. Their armies had marched and marched and marched, and the map of the ancient world had begun to redraw itself around them. By the time Belshazzar sat as co-regent in Babylon, Cyrus was at the borders. His forces were closing. Everyone in the capital knew it. The city, of course, was thought to be impregnable. Its walls were legendary. Its stores were vast. Its river ran through the middle of it, so that even a long siege could not starve it. Babylon had been besieged before in earlier ages, and Babylon had always held. There was, in the streets and in the palaces, a strong and comfortable confidence that whatever was coming, the walls would take care of it. And Daniel, in his upper room, went on facing the window. He had lived here now for something close to 70 years. He had come as a boy of 13. He was, by any reasonable count, in his 80s. He had outlived the king who had brought him, and the king's son, and the murderers of the king's son, and the several short-lived kings who had come after. He had outlived nearly everyone he had known as a young man. His 3 companions, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Whether they still lived, the record does not say. It is likeliest that at least some of them had gone before him. He was the last of them, or nearly. An old man in a foreign city, in the palace of a young co-regent who had not been born when Daniel first stood before Nebuchadnezzar. And still, 3 times a day, he went to the window. And still, he knelt. And still, he faced the direction of a city that was no longer a city, and gave thanks. 70 years, roughly 25,000 mornings, 25,000 times of turning, of kneeling, of speaking in Hebrew the words that had shaped his boyhood. It is a number that resists being felt. One can say it. One can hardly imagine it. A practice held so long that it had become indistinguishable from the man himself. He no longer chose it, each day, the way he had once chosen it as a boy at the king's table. It chose him. It was the shape his life took. It was, by now, simply what Daniel was. And in the palace of Belshazzar at the same hour, they were preparing a feast. The feast passed as feasts do, though this one passed strangely. Cups were lifted that should never have been lifted. Vessels from the temple in Jerusalem, the same vessels a young prince had carried away as trophies 70 years before, were brought out and filled with wine and passed among the drinkers. And in the middle of it, on the plaster of the palace wall, in the light of the lampstands, something like fingers appeared and wrote. Belshazzar's face changed. His knees, the record says, knocked together. The old man was sent for. The old man came. He read what the fingers had written. He said what it meant. He did not soften it. He was too old to soften anything. The kingdom, he said, was numbered and finished. It had been weighed and found wanting. It was being given to the Medes and the Persians. Belshazzar honoured him, dressed him in purple, put a chain of gold around his neck, proclaimed him third in the kingdom, because that is what men do when they no longer know what to do. And that same night, the city fell. How exactly it fell is a question the ancient sources answer in different ways, and the details do not concern us here. What concerns us is the morning after. The morning when Daniel woke in his upper room, and the banners on the walls were not the banners he'd gone to sleep beneath. The morning when the young co-regent lay dead in the palace, and a new army was in the streets, and the courts were being reorganized, and the officials were being sorted, and a new king, a man the record calls Darius the Mede, had taken the throne of Babylon. Daniel was, by then, in his early to mid-80s. He had seen this before, though not exactly like this. He had seen kings die. He had seen palaces change hands. He had watched the succession fracture after Nebuchadnezzar. He had learned, across a long life, that empires are less permanent than they insist, and he had learned too that the shape of his own days did not depend on which flag hung over the gate. So he went to the window, as he had done under Nebuchadnezzar, as he had done under Nebuchadnezzar's short-lived successors, as he had done under Nabonidus and Belshazzar, as he did now, 3 times, facing the ruined city, kneeling, giving thanks. Darius the Mede, whoever exactly he was, a figure the ancient records name but the historians still argue over, whether a governor set over Babylon, or a general given the province, or perhaps a title used of Cyrus himself. Darius took stock of the officials he had inherited. He was by all accounts a careful administrator. He divided his new territory into 120 provinces, each under its own satrap. Over the satraps he set 3 chief administrators, to whom the satraps were to give account so that the king would not suffer loss. And of those 3 chief administrators, one was the old man from Jerusalem. Daniel had by this point served every regime that had held Babylon for the better part of a human lifetime. He knew the treasuries, he knew the archives, he knew how the grain was moved and how the tribute was counted, and where the pressure points were in a province that had grown too large to hold itself together. There was, in the whole of the new empire, perhaps no one else who could match him for institutional memory. Darius saw it quickly, and Daniel, the record says, so distinguished himself among the administrators and satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. That was when the trouble began. The other administrators, the 2 who stood alongside him at the top of the pyramid, and the satraps beneath them, could see what was coming. An old Judean, a foreigner, a survivor of the Babylonians, was about to be placed over all of them. They did not accept it. They began to search for a reason to bring him down, some fault in his work, some negligence in his ledgers, some corruption in his dealings, some fragment of misconduct they could carry to the king. They searched, and they searched, and they found nothing. He was trustworthy, and not corrupt, and not negligent. 70 years of quiet fidelity in the palace bureaucracy had produced a record so clean that his enemies, hunting through it, came up empty-handed. And so they said among themselves, and the record preserves this in a sentence that sits at the center of the whole story: "We shall never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." They had noticed, of course. Everyone had noticed. The old man's window, the 3 times a day, the kneeling, the words in a language that was not the language of the empire. It had been for so long so ordinary a feature of the palace that no one thought of it as a vulnerability. But now, to men looking for a wound, it looked like the only wound available, so they laid their trap. They came to Darius not one by one, but as a delegation, a full body of administrators and prefects and satraps and advisors and governors, or at least the appearance of one. They came with a proposal, a test of loyalty for the new empire, a gesture to establish, in the difficult first months of a new regime, that the king held the affection of every man in every province. For 30 days, they proposed, let there be a decree that anyone who prays to any god or any man other than the king shall be thrown into the den of lions. 30 days only, a small season, a formality. And let the decree be signed under the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be altered. Darius, who was new to his throne, and who wanted a settled kingdom, and who did not yet know the man he was about to condemn as well as he thought he did, signed it. He put his seal to it, the decree went out, and Daniel heard. There is a small sentence in the record, easy to miss. When Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room, where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. And 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before. Just as he had done before. Consider that sentence. Consider what is in it, and what is not in it. There is no reasoning. There is no calculation. There is no strategic pause to weigh whether the decree might quietly be waited out. 30 days is not, after all, a long time for a man who has already prayed for something close to 25,000 mornings. There is no consultation, no gathering of allies. There is no defiance either, in the sense of a raised fist. He simply went home. He simply went upstairs. He simply opened the windows. He simply knelt. Because that was what he did. Because 70 years earlier, a boy at a foreign table had decided quietly not to eat the wrong food, and that quiet had grown into a life, and the life had grown into a habit, and the habit had grown into a nature, and now the nature could not, would not, and did not bend. They were watching, of course. They had gathered in a body. It was a coordinated thing, this trap. And they went to his house, and they found him praying and asking God for help. They had what they needed. They went to the king. First they reminded him of the decree and got him to confirm that yes, he had signed it, and yes, the law of the Medes and the Persians could not be revoked. And then they told him, Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. The record says that when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. He must have understood then, in one terrible instant, what had been done to him and by whom. He had signed away the life of the one man in his administration who was worth 10 of them, and the law he had signed could not be unsigned. He tried anyway, all day. The record does not tell us what he tried. Legal arguments, perhaps, loopholes, delays, appeals to precedent. He was, after all, the king. But the men who had built the trap were sharp, and they had built it well, and they came back to him as the sun was going down and pressed him to remember that no decree the king issues can be changed. And so, at sundown, the order was given. Daniel was brought out. He was, by any account, a very old man being marched to his execution by a machinery that neither wanted him dead nor could stop itself. The king, when they brought Daniel in front of him, said something strange. He did not say goodbye. He said, and the record preserves it, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. May your God, whom you serve continually." The king had noticed. Somewhere in the short time he had known this old administrator. He had understood the shape of the man's life. Not a religious man in the sense of festivals or offerings, but a man whose service was continual. A man who did not stop. A man whose God was evidently the one for whom he had lived the entire visible arc of his working life. Darius did not know if that God would answer, but he had seen enough to know who the man belonged to. They led Daniel to the pit. The pits used for keeping lions in the ancient world were exactly what the name suggests. A deep opening in the ground, walled in stone, with a single mouth at the top. The animals were kept hungry, or kept fed, according to what was wanted of them, and they lived in the dark at the bottom of the shaft. The mouth of the pit was closed with a large stone, rolled or lowered into place. On this night, once Daniel had been let down into the darkness, the stone was brought over the opening, and then, so that the king could not, in a moment of weakness in the night, send a man to lift it, the stone was sealed. First with the king's own signet ring pressed into wet clay, then with the signets of his nobles. The clay would harden, any tampering would show, the law would hold, and the king went back to his palace. The record tells us, in one short line, what he did that night. He spent the night without eating. No entertainment was brought to him, and he could not sleep. Picture it. The palace of Babylon by night, the lamps low, the corridors quiet, a new king in an old palace sitting up, refusing food, refusing music, refusing company, waiting for morning, not knowing whether the man he'd condemned was already dead in the dark, and not able to send anyone to find out, because the stone was sealed and could not be broken until the king himself went in the morning. There was nothing for him to do but sit through the hours. It was perhaps the longest night he'd ever known. And in the pit, in the dark, at the bottom of the stone shaft, silence. We do not know what Daniel did in the dark. The record does not tell us. It tells us afterward what happened, but it does not narrate the night. There is only the sealed stone and the silence of the deep pit, and one imagines a very old man in the dark, and lions, and the God he had faced 3 times a day for 70 years toward a city he had not seen since he was a boy. We are not told that he prayed, but it is difficult to imagine that he did not. We are not told that he was afraid. It is difficult to imagine that he was not, and difficult at the same time to imagine what fear even meant to a man who had lived that long. He had watched a furnace fail to burn his friends. He had watched a king become a beast and return again to himself. He had watched the writing appear on the wall. He had watched armies come to the gates. His life had been, for a very long time, a series of demonstrations that the God he prayed to was not a small God, and could not be measured against the powers of the visible world. Perhaps he was afraid. Perhaps he was calm. Perhaps he was simply tired, in the way old men become tired, and lay down in the dark and rested. The night went on. Above him, the king could not sleep. Above the king, the stars turned. Somewhere out in the empire, the messengers of the new administration were carrying the decree to every province, and men were reading it, and shrugging, and going home. Somewhere in the palace, the men who had built the trap slept the sleep of people who have won. And in the pit, the lions did not touch him. The first grey came into the sky at last. Darius did not wait for a servant to wake him. The record says he got up at the first light of dawn and hurried to the lion's den. Ran, in some translations. An old king running at dawn through the corridors of his own palace, out into the cold morning air, across the ground to the sealed mouth of the pit. When he came near, he called out. His voice, the record says, was anguished. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? The words are worth staying with. There is nothing casual in them. The king who had signed the decree had, at some point in the sleepless night, come to understand that if the God of this old man was real, then everything was different, and if the God of this old man was not real, then a good man was dead in the dark and it was his fault. He had lived, in that one night, some version of the same journey Nebuchadnezzar had made across decades. And now, at dawn, he was calling into a sealed pit, and did not know if any voice would answer. A voice answered, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king." The old man's voice, from the bottom of the pit, at daybreak, steady, courteous even. "Live forever," he says to the king who had ordered him thrown to his death. Not resentful, not triumphant, simply a report of what had happened. My God sent his angel. The lions did not hurt me. The record tells us that the king was overjoyed. He gave orders. The seals were broken. The stone was rolled away. Sit with that moment for a moment. The stone rolled away, and the light going in for the first time in the whole long night, reaching down into the dark, finding at the bottom an old man, uninjured, his robes not torn, his skin not marked, the lions somewhere in the shadows of the pit, quiet. He looks up, in the new light, at the mouth of the pit, at the faces looking down. They lower ropes, they lift him out. No injury was found on him, the record says, because he had trusted in his God. There is no shouting in the account. There is no crowd in the version we have gathered to cheer. There is only the king and the servants and the old man and the light coming into a place where no light had reached before. Vindication, but not triumph. Rescue, but not spectacle, the specific, quiet peace of a man whose long unremarkable faithfulness had, at the last, been met. What happened next was less quiet. The king was not evidently a man to leave a matter unfinished. He gave orders. The men who had built the trap were brought out, and they were thrown into the same pit. They and their families, the record says, in the harsh way of ancient justice, and the lions, no longer restrained, did not spare them. And then Darius sat down and wrote a decree. He wrote it to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language in the whole world. He wrote it as a king writes a decree, with all the machinery of empire behind it. And what he wrote was this: "In every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." Consider what that decree was. It was the second time in Daniel's life that an emperor had put into writing and sent out across the known world exactly what Daniel had been quietly saying with his life. Nebuchadnezzar had done it once, near the end, and now Darius. The empire's own record, in the empire's own words, on the empire's own tablets and scrolls, testifying to the same thing the old man at the window had testified to for 70 years. He is the living God. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. Daniel, the record says, prospered during the reign of Darius and during the reign of Cyrus the Persian. He was given back his position. He kept his office. He served as he had always served and prayed as he had always prayed, and the window in the upper room stayed open toward Jerusalem, though he was by now older than nearly any man in the empire. And then, in the first year of Cyrus, a decree of a different kind went out. Cyrus, who had a policy across his empire of returning displaced peoples to their homelands, issued a proclamation. Any of the people of the God of Heaven who wished to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple were free to go. They could take with them, from the treasuries of Babylon, the vessels of the house of God, the same vessels a young prince had carried away 70 years earlier from the temple in Jerusalem and placed in the storeroom of Marduk. Those vessels were being brought out, counted, wrapped, prepared for the long road home. Daniel did not go. He was by then too old for the road, and his work was where he was. But he lived to see it. He lived to see the exile officially end. He lived to see the caravan gathered. He lived to see the vessels leave the storeroom. Some of the people going home were the grandchildren, or the great-grandchildren, of the ones who had come with him as a boy. Some of them had never seen Jerusalem. They are going home to a place they had never been, because he and others like him had refused, across 70 years, to let it be forgotten. Daniel continued, the record says quietly, until the first year of King Cyrus. Continued. That is the word the record uses. Not triumphed, not conquered, not overcame. Continued. He continued. He kept on. He did the thing he did. He faced the window. He knelt. He gave thanks. He did his work. He continued. That is what it says. And when at last he laid down his life, we are not told exactly where, or how, or under whose reign. The record is silent on his end, as it has been silent on so many of the ordinary passages of his long life. But consider now, from the height of these last pages, what the whole shape of it was. A boy of 13 taken from Jerusalem in 605, a man in his 80s still in service in 538. Between those two dates, 70 years. 4 kings at least, Nebuchadnezzar and his short-lived successors, and Belshazzar and Darius and Cyrus. 2 empires. a city that had risen to be the wonder of the world and then, in a single night, was no longer the center of anything. A temple that had been carried away and at the very end was being carried home. And through all of it, one man, the same man, from the boy at the king's table to the old man at the window, the same person, held together by the same practice. That is the quiet argument of the story. That identity is not an event but an accumulation. That faithfulness is not a single heroic act but 10,000 ordinary ones. That the most enduring thing in the ancient world, more enduring than the walls of Babylon, more enduring than the armies of Persia, more enduring than any decree of any king, was not a monument, or an army, or a treasury. It was a man who kept his window open. It was a boy who quietly refused the wrong food. It was a young administrator who prayed in Hebrew in a Babylonian palace. It was a grown man who spoke truth to a king who did not always want to hear it. It was an old man who knelt 3 times a day in a language his masters could not understand. The great walls of Babylon fell. The processional way in time was buried under sand. The gates and the ziggurat and the hanging terraces passed into ruin, and travellers in later centuries would stand on the mounds and wonder what had once been there. The empires that came after, Persian, Greek, Roman, each one rose in its turn and each one fell in its turn, and the small, unspectacular practice of a Judean exile in an upper room, the turning, the kneeling, the giving of thanks, continued, was carried home, was written down, is being read now, over 2,500 years later, in a room somewhere in the world where a listener has closed their eyes. That is the story. A teenage boy taken from Jerusalem as a prisoner of war, renamed, re-educated, deliberately rebuilt into a Babylonian, who refused anyway, not dramatically, not with a sword, quietly, consistently, across 70 years, across 4 kings, across 2 empires, across a fiery furnace and a pit of lions, across the long stretches of ordinary days that made up nearly the whole of it. An old man at the end in an upper room facing a window toward a city he had not seen since he was a boy. The light of morning coming in, everything he had been still there, nothing lost, nothing forgotten, nothing bent. He continued, and so, in the quiet, may we.